Imagine a close-knit neighborhood where kids play safely in the street and everyone knows each other. It's an environment where neighbors are close friends, residents look out for one another, and a helping hand is just across the street. But sometimes not all is as it seems from the outside. An idyllic suburban life in an upscale part of town where cares seem to be few can in fact be a place where danger lurks behind a facade of well-manicured lawns, European cars, and six-figure salaries. And for one woman who thought she was living in an upscale neighborhood in one of the safest parts of the country, the dreams she thought would come true came crashing down around her. Hi, everyone. Welcome to episode 22 of the Darklivity podcast. I'm your host, Kimberly, and I'm here with my co-host, my biggest supporter and partner in crime, the love of my life, Jonathan.
Hi. Darklivity is the dark downward slope into the degradation of the human mind and the consequences that such darkness brings to light.
Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe, hit the notification bell so you don't miss out, and thank you in advance for your patience. I'm in the last few weeks of my pregnancy right now, which is unbelievable. So our schedule might get a little crazy. But our story today doesn't start in the United States. I want to take you first to Canada and introduce you to Nancy Lynn Rentz. Now, Nancy was born to her father, Gary, and her mother, Donna, on August 25th, 1973 in the city of Edmonton. Nancy wasn't the only new addition to the family the very same day that she came into the world because she had a built-in best friend in the form of her identical twin sister, Krista, who is only 5 minutes older. And this is actually the second case we've done with identical twins in it. The other one was the Lena Kaufman case. Remember that? Of course. Lena's husband, Adam, had an identical twin brother, Seth. And that was a wild case. But back to this one. When twin sisters Nancy and Krista welcomed their younger sister Jill 9 years later, the family was finally complete, with the three girls joining their older brother, Jeff. Edmonton, where the Rentz family lived and Nancy grew up, is the capital of the province of Alberta. And at the time, the city was home to 442,000 people. It's also known as the oil capital of Canada, and it thrived off the back of the oil boom. But during Nancy's childhood, the retail sector provided much of the needed employment opportunities when the city became home to West Edmonton Mall. I don't know if you've seen this mall, heard about it, but it is the largest mall in North America, well, at the time, and it's very well known. The city was the perfect place to raise a family with a good job market, affordable housing, and excellent schools. And though Nancy and Krista were identical, and they shared a very tight bond that only twins can, personality-wise, they were opposites. Nancy was bubbly and outgoing, while Krista was more reserved. One thing they fought over as teens, which probably won't surprise you, was clothing. I wonder if brothers fight over clothes, because I know I have two younger sisters. John's an only child, so he didn't have to fight over much. But my sisters used to steal all of my things from my closet, and even my sister's friends would steal them. So I know all about the fights it can cause, but of course we would always make up, and so would Nancy and Krista. Nancy loved fashion, accessories, and art. And when Krista snuck things out of her sister's closet, Nancy was not happy. But of course, this didn't affect their closeness. They were each other's biggest cheerleaders. Nancy clashed a lot with her younger sister Jill, though, due to their similar personalities and their shared determined streak. But they were all very close. Jill even idolized her big sisters.
When Nancy was a young girl, she became a talented ringette player. This is a game that's a lot like hockey, which Nancy played competitively and she was very good at. It was even said that she could one day reach Olympic level competition. However, during one particular match, Nancy sustained a serious knee injury, putting an end to that dream. But Nancy knew it was important to stay active after she recovered, so she got into running, eventually challenging herself by competing in marathons when she became an adult. The adrenaline rush of finishing and knowing she'd pushed through the pain gave her that euphoric runner's high, that which so many long-distance runners can attest to. Running also helped Nancy manage her Crohn's disease, which she had developed. And if you don't know, Crohn's disease is a debilitating inflammatory condition that has a significant impact impact on the quality of life. Despite her condition, Nancy was gregarious and outgoing. She was truly a lot of fun, and she made friends easily. People gravitated to her upbeat nature and her love for laughing and having a good time. If you were having a bad day, Nancy could quickly put a smile on your face and make you forget whatever was bothering you.
So much so that her younger sister Jill said that no one was ever sad around Nancy.
That's how I feel like with you.
That's how I feel about you. Nobody's sad around you. They're always laughing.
After finishing college, Nancy moved to Calgary, where she and Krista shared an apartment. Nancy also ran her own clothing boutique and worked in IT tech support for TransCanada Pipelines.
It was at that job in Calgary in 1998 that Nancy soon met a man that she couldn't help but notice. She thought he was tall, dark, and handsome, and he was one of her coworkers contracted by IBM. His name was Brad Cooper. Brad was originally from Alberta in the city of Medicine Hat, where he was raised by his parents, Terry and Carol, and just 7 weeks younger than Nancy. Now, the thing is, kind of like when you and I met John, when Nancy first met Brad, he wasn't single. He was actually engaged to another woman. He was quiet, but brilliant. He was a talented and hardworking computer engineer, the type to kind of keep his head down and stay in his own lane. But just like what happened in my own engagement a couple of years after John and I met, the same thing was happening with Brad's relationship. Him and his fiance were going through a lot of troubles, and their relationship was deteriorating over time. And finally, the engagement ended. And of course, Brad was dealing with a lot. He was feeling pretty down. So Nancy, having been acquainted with him, she tried setting him up with one of her friends that she thought would hit it off really well with him. But soon, the two of them realized that they had a connection, and eventually was actually Nancy and Brad that ended up dating. Nancy's mom, Donna, and her sister Jill really liked Brad. They could see just how happy Nancy was. He was highly intelligent, and he generously helped their family get their own computer network system for their family business. They called him a legend, but he wasn't the kind of guy that Nancy usually went for because he was quite introverted compared to her. She was a very outgoing, and he was kind of like sitting back, being a little bit more quiet, letting her take the lead. But Nancy knew that he was stable and grounded, someone that she envisioned having a future with and a family, which was definitely something she wanted.
When Brad proposed on Christmas Day of 1999, Nancy began planning their wedding for spring of 2001. But then a new career opportunity was presented to Brad. He was headhunted to work for a voice communications technology company called Cisco Systems in the United States out in North Carolina. If he accepted this position, he'd be working in the company's office that was located in Research Triangle Park, just outside the state capital of Raleigh in Wake County. This was an incredible opportunity. It was too good to pass up. But at this point in his career, Brad was highly sought after in voice-over internet protocol systems.
I did not know what that meant, and I thought it was important, and little details are very important to me. So it's called VoIP, right?
VoIP.
Oh, VoIP? So you don't say the letters?
Yeah, people call it VoIP.
Oh, okay. Well, it's the ability to make calls over the internet, which we all know happens nowadays. But instead of making phone calls through analog, through phone lines, this became a thing in the mid-90s. So it was a fairly new type of technology at the time, and Brad was exactly the expert this company needed to expand it and provide it as a service to their customers. Now, at the time, he would become one of only 150 other experts of this kind in the world. So that's pretty big.
It's very big, and it was an amazing offer. But of course, this wasn't just a choice Brad would have to make. With Nancy now engaged to marry him, she'd had to think about what this meant for herself, her career, and her future. Now, at the time, Brad was further along in his career than Nancy was, so it made sense to lean toward Brad accepting the offer. Plus, as part of the opportunity, Cisco would arrange for a spousal visa so that Nancy could move to the United States with Brad.
That's right. I didn't even think about that, but neither one of them were citizens of the United States. But if Brad took this position, he'd be given what's known as an H-1B visa, and that allows U.S. employers to temporarily hire foreign workers in specialties. And the specialties are usually engineering, biological, physical, and social sciences, math, or business administration.
And this type of visa allows for a spouse or minor children to relocate to the state with the visa holder under an H-4 visa, but only if the couple is married. And Nancy and Brad weren't married yet, they were only engaged. And after thinking it through, the couple decided this opportunity was in fact too good not to take. So Brad and Nancy moved their wedding forward, and on October 13th, 2000, the 27-year-olds married in Calgary in a small ceremony before the Justice of the Peace, in the presence of Nancy's family.
October 13th is a cool wedding date.
I agree.
It's definitely not going to be our wedding date, but we had to take what we could get. It wasn't the wedding Nancy had envisioned either. They wanted a big wedding. He got her this gorgeous big diamond ring, and they wanted to have, more of an extravagant experience. But like many of us, Nancy understood that life is unpredictable, and sometimes we have to make compromises so that we can move forward in life. And I have to say, it was a pretty big compromise to leave her own family behind to follow Brad to the United States. But Nancy was excited for what the future would bring. And that didn't stop the tears, though, at the airport when she had to say goodbye to her family. It was tough. But soon, things were coming together for the couple. In January of 2001, they settled in Cary, North Carolina. It's an upscale suburb west of Raleigh. Their new home was a 4-bedroom, 2.5-bath, almost 3,000 square foot, 2-story brick house at 104 Wellsburg Court in Cary's leafy Lockmere subdivision. Now, I'm assuming that this home was part of the relocation deal that Brad made with Cisco. That's pretty typical for companies to give you an allowance towards a place to live, and this was a very nice place to live. It's what many people would call a dream home. It had a nice big backyard with a deck, spacious bedrooms, shiny hardwood floors, and this location is the quintessential upper middle class, family-oriented suburban dream. Lots of expansive houses on large blocks of land where trees line the streets, and many residents, mostly professionals with young families, could afford the lifestyle thanks to the dot-com boom in the late 1990s. And according to Money Magazine, Cary was considered one of the best small cities in America at the time, despite the population growing by over 25,000 in just a decade. Cary also took pride in being one of the safest places to live in the country, with an exceptionally low crime rate. But not only did Nancy have to leave her family and her own career goals behind in Canada, but as part of Nancy's visa conditions in the United States, she wasn't allowed to work. And that was tough for someone who had always been so independent. She knew it was going to be a significant change, quitting her IT job, stopping work temporarily altogether. But she loved Brad, and she was prepared to make that sacrifice because she was very much focused on wanting to eventually become a mom. I know that I am personally not the type who could just not work. I've tried it. I get bored to death. And someone as outgoing as Nancy, it was going to be hard.
But Nancy soon found that the winding wooded trails around the local subdivision and nearby lakes made for the perfect running routes. And running had been her thing for a while. She had hours to spare while Brad was at work, so she couldn't think of a better way to spend her time than training for running events. She also joined a local gym to continue training during the winter months.
She hadn't met many friends yet, which was hard when you don't have a job, because that's where people usually connect, especially when they're out of college and they're working their careers. But it was at the gym during boot camp that she met her first close friend, Carrie Clark, who shared Nancy's passion for running and would become her main running partner. Now, Carrie had a more introverted personality, so Nancy took her under her wing, and the pair soon became close friends. They met a few times during the week, and they would run and chat about what was going on in their lives, usually having a cup of coffee together afterward.
Even though Nancy was a natural extrovert, she struggled with social isolation when she and Brad first moved to Cary. But because of her warm, animated personality and her natural ability to quickly make friends and connect on an authentic level with people, that soon worked to her advantage. Nancy began befriending women in her neighborhood and in Cary itself. She felt more at ease with the massive life change that she and Brad had made because of her growing social circle. Her new friends admired Nancy's natural elegance, poise, and style, in addition to her many other positive personal qualities. Nancy loved to cook, entertain, and she also attended a book club, and she joined her friends on girls' nights. She also loved attending outdoor concerts staged by the North Carolina Symphony at the Coca Booth Amphitheater.
Now, I did say that working helps people make friends, especially when they move to a new place. But working too much and being too in demand at work and not given the time to really socialize at work can also isolate people as well. And Brad didn't have many close friends since the move. You already know this man was more of an introvert and he worked long hours. But thankfully, on his time off, he did get to know the husbands of Nancy's new friends. So he would socialize in the same circles, and soon they were going on double dates. They were meeting other couples and expanding both of their social circles. But something was missing. Kids. Of course, it took a couple years for Brad to really solidify himself at Cisco and both he and Nancy to get acclimated to living in a new country. But when the couple were ready to start a family, it gave Nancy a renewed sense of purpose. It's hard when you are a stay-at-home wife sometimes without kids or a job, and the years are passing by. Nancy and Brad spent every Christmas with Nancy's family and also enjoyed their annual vacations. And she wanted nothing more than a family of her own. Remember, Brad and Nancy were close to 30 when they made this move to North Carolina. And sadly, the couple suffered several miscarriages, which, as any woman who's lived through a pregnancy loss will know, it can be unbelievably painful in so many ways.
But finally, the Coopers had something to celebrate. On February 23rd, 2004, Nancy gave birth to a daughter. They named her Isabella. They called her Bella for short. And then just 2 years later, they welcomed a second daughter on July 23rd, 2006. They named her Gabriella, but they called her by her nickname, Katie. Nancy was a great mother from the moment her children were born. She had an innate maternal instinct and she was completely devoted to the girls, to whom she used to sing the classic song that many of us grew up hearing and singing, "You Are My Sunshine." The girls were Nancy's world.
I'm sure, especially because she didn't have a career like Brad. And it's as though they were her number one priority, and her job was now the homemaker and the caretaker. And it really did give Nancy her own purpose.
Nancy had all the time in the world to devote to her daughters, and one of their favorite things to do was go to Symphony Lake in the nearby Regency Park and throw breadcrumbs to the swans. She also had more in common with many of the other women in the community who were already mothers, and Nancy quickly became like a second mother to the children of her friends and neighbors as well. The neighborhood kids loved going hunting for frogs in the area, and even though Nancy wasn't a fan of the harmless amphibians, she took the children exploring. The kids laughed and squeals of delight made the experience totally worth it.
I was, and I still am, a huge reptile and amphibian lover. I don't think I've gone a couple of years in my life without having a frog, a lizard, some other reptile. I've had iguanas, bearded dragons, all kinds of frogs ever since I was a kid. And I learned about tadpoles. What kind of pets did y'all have? I want to hear from you in the comments. You had cats, right?
Yeah, we had stray cats, we had weird rats, we had dogs, frogs, mice, and I think my dad had a monkey apparently when I was a baby.
Okay, I was not expecting that.
When Bella started preschool in 2006 at the Triangle Academy Preschool, Nancy met fellow mom Jessica Adam, whose son is the same age as Bella. Nancy and Jessica quickly grew close and were soon pounding the pavement, regularly running together on the nearby trails. Meanwhile, Brad was excelling at work and gaining notoriety. By now, he was a Cisco-certified intra-network expert, one of a select few of IT professionals across the world with that level of expertise. Outside of work, Brad's biggest passion was competing in triathlons and Ironman competitions, and he documented his training journey and progress in a blog he created. He was also studying during this time in late 2007. Brad had finished his MBA in North Carolina State University and was pulling in a total income of over $135,000. That's just over $200,000 today.
Now, don't hate me for saying this, but when I was reading that, I thought about inflation, especially here and even in Canada, actually. And that's not a lot to live on now. It really isn't. It's like every family needs a double income of that much, or at least one income that's double that to thrive. I'm not talking about just surviving, but everything has gotten so expensive, especially here in LA. That would be like the bare minimum, which is pretty sad. But it used to be a lot of money, and Brad was working hard for it. He devoted up to 20 hours each week to classes and studying, in addition to working full-time. But his drive was paying off and being able to provide a good life for his family, and Nancy was still enjoying being a stay-at-home mom. but was looking forward to getting back into the workforce herself when the girls were older. Then it would be her turn to shine in her own career, since she had helped with the house and the kids so that Brad could thrive in his career endeavors. They both had to make sacrifices. For example, Brad couldn't always join in on the family fun. He would often miss out on milestones and even vacations. In late 2008, in June, Nancy's parents, Gary and Donna, and her sister Krista and Krista's husband, Jim, they traveled down to North Carolina for a 9-day family summer vacation to High Rock Lake near Charlotte and Hilton Head in South Carolina. And unfortunately, Brad was not able to join them, but it was a wonderful opportunity for Nancy to spend time with her family and for them to see how Bella and Katie were growing up. They spent their days swimming and soaking up the sun and cooking s'mores over bonfires and making the sort of summer memories you'll never forget. A week or so after returning home from vacation on Friday, July 11, 2008, Nancy took her daughters to meet with her close friend Hannah Pritchard and her kids at a local swimming pool, along with one of their other friends, Susan Crook. The weather was so nice, the trio arranged to meet the following morning for another swim. That evening, 34-year-old Nancy took Bella and Katie across the street to the home of their friends Diana and Craig Duncan for a neighborhood potluck cookout. Nancy actually prepared ribs for the event and brought them over for the guests to enjoy. This time, Brad had some free time to hang out and enjoy the company of his family and friends. He arrived a little later, around 7 p.m. Nancy was looking forward to spending a warm, relaxed summer evening with great company, conversation, and of course, a few drinks. She wore a teal dress with capped sleeves, showing off her lean runner's physique. Nancy had a great time. She was chatting with her friends while partaking in some wine, ribs, chips, and dip, and finishing off with lemon cake.
But it was getting late for the girls, so around 8 p.m., Brad left early, taking the girls back home, leaving Nancy to enjoy the rest of the night just hanging out.
Now, some would say, oh, that's so nice of him to take the kids off her hands, and she's always with them and probably needs some girl time. And it's true. But when I hear that, I always think, well, they're his kids too. And I'm a believer in shared responsibility. I know Brad is a very hard worker, and some couples don't mind having these set roles. I just cringe sometimes when I hear people say like the dad babysat. I'm like, no, he parented. And that night, Nancy received a call from her friend Jessica around 10:30 p.m. asking if she wanted to come over. But Nancy was having way too much fun at the party, so she told Jessica she would see her the next morning at around 8 o'clock because she was going to help Jessica paint her dining room, which is something they arranged to do earlier that week. So as the guests left, Nancy helped Diana clean up and then went home around midnight. Over at Jessica's house later that Saturday morning, 8 a.m. came and went. But Jessica didn't hear from or see Nancy, who was due to come over to paint as planned. Jessica was concerned because Nancy was reliable. Plus, they had just discussed this a few hours ago. So Jessica called the Cooper household around 8:45, and Brad answered, and Jessica asked if she could speak with Nancy. Brad explained that Nancy had gone for a run with another friend, Carrie. Jessica was confused because she figured Nancy would have told her about a plan like that, especially since Jessica and Nancy were running buddies. They were actually training for the same half marathon in Virginia Beach that was going to happen that August. But without another way to reach Nancy because she already tried her cell phone and she didn't answer, Jessica decided to go to the gym and she would check in later to see if Nancy was home.
Brad was too slightly confused. Jessica explained that the two had plans that morning and Nancy hadn't shown up. But he wasn't necessarily worried because Nancy knew Brad had plans of his own that day. He was supposed to play tennis with his friend Mike Hiller at 9:30 a.m. It had been arranged the night before at the cookout. Nancy was right there and she confirmed that she would be home with the kids. And Nancy had also told Mike and his wife Laura that she wanted them to come by Saturday night to play a game called Sequence with her and Brad. So when Nancy still wasn't home by 9 a.m., Brad called Mike 15 minutes later, letting him know Nancy wasn't back and they needed to reschedule. Around 10 a.m., Brad received a call from Hannah, who Nancy had been due to meet at a pool that morning after painting at Jessica's. Brad told her what he told Jessica, that Nancy had gone for a run. but she wasn't back yet. He didn't know where she could be, and everyone was starting to worry.
Jessica called over to the Cooper's house again after her gym session, but Brad told her there was still no word from Nancy. And then around 12:30, Jessica got a call from Brad asking if she had Carrie's number, the woman that she went running with, because Nancy was still not home. Jessica didn't have the number and she only knew Carrie's first name. Jessica learned that Hannah had also called the house looking for their friend and that Brad had asked her for Carrie's number as well. Jessica offered to come watch the kids so that Brad could go track down this Carrie woman and go look for Nancy. He told her he already had the girls in the car and they hung up so that he could go out and look. Jessica felt like something was wrong right away. She called Hannah, and both women then contacted 2 hospitals nearby to check if Nancy had possibly been involved in an accident, but no one with her name or her description had been admitted. Jessica then drove over to Nancy's, where she saw Nancy's BMW SUV parked in the driveway. When Jessica looked through the window, she saw Nancy's purse and her BlackBerry on the front seat, which was really odd. Nancy was never without her phone. So at 1:50 p.m., Jessica called 911. She reported Nancy as missing. She told the dispatcher it was not like Nancy not to call if something had happened, adding the comment, quote, "Her husband and her are in the middle of a divorce," end quote. Now, we haven't mentioned this until now, but we definitely are going to come back to this. But let's listen to part of this 911 call.
Here's Lisa's Jane. Can I help you?
Hi, my name is Jessica Adam, and I'm calling because a friend of mine has been looking since 7 o'clock this morning, and her husband and her are in the middle of a divorce. I'm not sure what the protocol would be, but she's supposed to go out for a run this morning at 7 o'clock to Moss there, and no one has heard from her.
You tried making contact with her?
So, okay, the situation is that her husband, when I called this morning at about 9, that he said that she had left this morning for a run early. He believed with her friend Carrie, and that seems fine and normal. But apparently she did not return, and the situation is a little bit. She should have been here. She was expected here no later than 9 o'clock to help me with the project. And then she also had another appointment with a friend. Her name is Hannah, who just called me on the line, hysterical.
So at this point, Nancy's friends called her twin sister, Krista, asking if she had spoken to Nancy that day, but she hadn't. She hadn't heard from her either. Now, this was concerning because the sisters spoke every single day. Krista called their brother Jeff, who happens to be a police officer back in Canada, and he suggested that they'd calm down and wait. He was sure Nancy would turn up anytime. Their parents, Gary and Donna, were attending a funeral back in Edmonton when Krista called them, saying Nancy hadn't come home from a run that morning. Without hesitation, the Rentz family, including Krista and Jeff, made plans to get to North Carolina. And as they were leaving the church, Gary looked over at his wife and said, "Donna, this story is not going to have a happy ending."
Wow, that was kind of fast for them to pick up and fly out to North Carolina and for her dad to kind of make that statement.
Really?
But one thing is that Nancy had Crohn's disease and she would not have been away from home for long. Plus, she had plans that day with multiple people and she had 2 girls that were her main priority. And because of all these circumstances, everyone was worried. And the Cary Police Department were taking it very seriously as well. By 3 p.m., Patrol Officer Daniel Hayes and Detective Adam Dismutes arrived at the Cooper residence, joined later by Detective George Daniels. Brad pulled into the driveway shortly after they arrived. He had driven out to Regency Park, a place she frequently went running to look for Nancy. Around 12 to 15 neighbors were already gathered outside the house.
Brad quickly made his way to the officers and took them inside to inspect the home. He called out Nancy's name, hoping she had come home while he was out. Officer Hayes noticed the house was extremely untidy. He saw opened packing boxes stacked in rooms and clothes strewn about. Toys were scattered throughout the house, and the upstairs bathroom was very cluttered.
Well, I mean, to be fair, they do have 2 children, I think 2 dogs as well. Brad's busy at work. It wouldn't be that uncommon for a home to be messy, especially on the weekend when everyone's there.
Right. Our house is untidy at times as well.
Definitely.
But these were just observations that the officer was adding up, because upon further examination of the home, Officer Hayes noticed that on each end of the attached primary bathroom counter were 2 bottles of cleaning supplies, including a container of Clorox wipes, and the downstairs kitchen counter was completely clean, which was interesting among all the other untidy surfaces and areas.
I'm thinking of our house again, and it wouldn't be that weird. Like,
Right.
we have Clorox bottles on our counters, and one counter might be clean.
Yeah.
And maybe Nancy had started cleaning that morning before her run, and she hadn't finished yet. I do that all the time. I'll start on one area. I have ADHD for real.
Yeah.
But I'll start on one area and then just get interrupted by something.
Me too. So now the officers asked Brad when he saw Nancy last, and he told the officer that they both attended a party at a friend's house across the street the night before. He went home to get the girls to bed and was asleep when he heard the door to the home open sometime around midnight. Probably close to around 12:30 is when he heard Nancy come home and come upstairs. Then he said he was awoken again around 4 a.m. when their younger daughter Katie started crying. So he got up, retrieved her from her room, and took her downstairs to try to settle her while Nancy slept. But about 20 minutes later, Nancy came down to help with Katie. Brad explained they tag-teamed off and on with their children when they were fussy at night, trying to keep crying Katie calm and occupied so she would fall back to sleep, but they had no luck. They had also ran out of milk, so around 6 a.m., Brad told police he went out to buy milk at the local Harris Teeter store upon Nancy's request, ultimately making 2 trips after receiving a call from Nancy while he was out asking him to bring home some laundry detergent and green juice. So he turned back around and went back to get those additional items. When he got home, he took Katie into his home office upstairs to trade off with Nancy, who was at this point getting ready to go for her run, which was completely normal. It's something she did almost every morning. Brad explained that sometime after that, Brad heard the front door open and close, so he assumed Nancy left.
And he further explained that Nancy told him she was going running with her friend Carrie, and he hadn't actually seen Nancy leave, but she'd actually called out at one point asking where a particular running shirt was, and she was searching for it. She wasn't exactly asking Brad for help, but she was kind of like looking around, half asking herself and thinking out loud, like, where's my, running shirt? Then Brad heard the door slam shut, so he assumed that she'd gone. Brad provided a physical description of his wife and said she was most likely wearing a t-shirt, running shorts, and blue running shoes, which was her usual running attire. And he cooperated with law enforcement's request to conduct an initial search of the home and the couple's car. He had a 2001 BMW 325i sedan, and Nancy had a silver 2004 X5 SUV. And when asked about her cell phone, despite Jessica having earlier seen Nancy's BlackBerry on the front seat of the car, Brad took it out of a drawer and gave it to the investigators, so he must have gone and looked for it and retrieved it. Nancy's keys, which she always had with her for reasons we'll explain later, were inside the house as well. And for someone who always took her keys with her, even on her run, this was odd. I know we're keeping you in the dark about certain details, but this is what was unfolding at the time.
Neighbors wanted to offer support right away, but Brad seemed anxious and worried, maybe preoccupied with trying to piece together what could have happened. He was a quiet guy to begin with, so it seems that all the attention on his family was uncomfortable, even though it was for good reason. But though he spoke openly with the investigators, he was not engaging in conversation or making eye contact with the neighbors outside, who were asking questions and wanting information.
I mean, that's overwhelming for anyone, especially an introvert. And usually the public isn't given details until the police are sure that it won't interfere with the investigation. And Brad did ask their across the street neighbor, Diana Duncan, to help him find that dress that Nancy wore the night before, which he claimed was black. So a police dog was there and they were trying to pick up a scent, and that dress was what she was wearing last, but it seemed to be missing. And Diana remembered it was green or aqua. So Brad looked through the laundry but couldn't locate the dress, and they really wanted something she had just recently worn so the scent would be strong. But time was of the essence, so Brad gave another detective who had arrived, Jim Young, a pair of Nancy's running shoes instead. Now, meanwhile, police began interviewing Nancy's friends who were outside the house, and an immediate search got underway in both the local neighborhood and along the running routes that Nancy used in Lockmere and Regency. Dana Duncan and Teresa O'Driscoll helped organize over 200 people to search for the mother of two. They printed flyers and they posted these wherever they could. Volunteers combed nearby wooded areas and everywhere in between the Cooper house and Jessica's house 6 miles away.
Nancy's friends and neighbors had a terrible feeling. She was completely devoted to her children, and there was no way on earth she would leave them. So why hadn't she contacted anyone or even left a note? In addition to her BlackBerry and keys, she hadn't taken any ID with her either. The next day, on Sunday, July 13th, a National Guard helicopter and the Wake County Sheriff's Office were out in force. At this point, introverted or not, Brad made a public plea for information as to his wife's whereabouts. We have a portion of that we can play for you.
Thanks. I don't really have a prepared statement, but I just wanted to thank all the hundreds of volunteers that came out and are continuing to come out. And if anyone knows anything, I just want them to contact the police with any information they may have. And again, thank you to everyone that continues to come out and help out. Thanks.
Volunteers continued searching for Nancy, distributing flyers. Even rainy conditions didn't deter those wanting to do anything they could to help find Nancy. Brad gave officers more information about what Nancy may have been wearing. He'd since noticed a pair of her running shoes missing from their usual spot in the laundry area. Nancy's friend Diana, who hosted the cookout, even started a blog to update everyone on the search. But there was no sign of Nancy anywhere.
I have to say, her family and friends acted so quickly, which is really important because I'd be the same way. But I do think a lot of us would, because here we are watching true crime stories. Even if my friend ended up returning, you just never know. So it doesn't hurt to do the most in these situations because you don't want to look back and wish that you had called or searched sooner. And just 2 days after Nancy disappeared, on Monday, July 14th, over 30 police officers continued searching with volunteers around Lake Wheeler and Lake Johnson. Brad did admit to reporters that he and Nancy were having some marital conflict, but he never thought it was anything that would make her just up and leave. And her family and friends said the same thing, insisting there was no way Nancy would have been under so much stress to make her leave her kids behind. I mean, is that common? Because in so many cases, I hear it made as a suggestion, like maybe she just decided to leave. I know it can happen, but whenever I hear that anyone's even suggesting that, I have to say they would at least confide in one person. Like someone would know that they were upset and leaving.
I totally agree.
But soon everyone would find out that was not Nancy's intention at all. Because that evening, around 7:30 p.m., a local resident, William Boyer, was out walking his dog in an underdeveloped subdivision called the Oaks at Meadow Ridge off Holly Spring Road, near the 4700 block of Fielding Drive. There were no houses in this part of town yet. It was just 3 miles from the Cooper's residence, and it only had wooded areas. And as William got close to the end of a cul-de-sac, he looked up and he noticed there were a number of crows cawing. And then he saw that there were turkey vultures in the trees, and that is not a good sign. They're often associated with death and called the Grim Reaper because they have this haunting look about them and usually come around when they smell a dead animal. Well, when William looked on the ground near a drainage ditch filled with water, something was laying there motionless, and he thought it was a deer carcass. But as he got closer, he realized it was much bigger and not a deer at all. William immediately called 911, reporting that he was sure he just found a deceased human body.
When officers arrived, they found the partially nude body of a woman lying face down. Senior Agent Christopher Hill from the City County Bureau of Identification began processing the scene. The body was partially decomposed and only in a red and black elastic sports bra, which had been bunched up under her arms, exposing her top half. She also wore 2 diamond earrings, but one was fallen out of the earlobe. There were no signs of struggle, and the mud around the body was relatively undisturbed, aside from the shoe prints and tire tracks. So they figured she had been dumped there and killed somewhere else. Near the woman's body were 2 pieces of electrical wire and a squashed cigarette butt. Unfortunately, due to the muddy terrain, crime scene technicians were unable to take casts of the shoe prints to eliminate those left by authorities. They did manage to get some casts from the tire tracks, though it wasn't clear they were from the same vehicle. Officers fanned out across the nearby construction site searching for any additional evidence. They couldn't get a conclusive ID until Nancy's dental records had been cross-checked with the victim. But detectives knew it was the missing woman they were looking for. Everything added up: her hair, her eye color, her build, and the fact that she was in running attire and so close to where Nancy lived.
Because of this, they didn't hesitate to break the terrible news to Brad at the Cooper household around 10 p.m. that night. He was understandably devastated and confused. He was just standing there rubbing his forehead and moaning. He wanted to know who would have done this to the woman that he loved and the mother of his children. In a world where women aren't even safe to run around their own neighborhood during daylight hours, it was terrifying to think someone could have attacked Nancy while she was out where she felt comfortable. But could she have let her guard down? Could someone with something evil on their mind have engaged her in conversation, only for her to realize they were there to hurt her and it was too late? The immediate grief and pain for Nancy's family was unbearable. Their worst fears were confirmed. For Krista, the anguish was exceptionally tough. She felt for days that Nancy's spirit was gone, and now she felt like she literally lost half of herself. And as a twin, I'm sure that hits harder. Nancy's family made a public statement, and I couldn't help but tear up when I heard Krista speak. Let's play that part.
I wanted to quickly say something about my sister. So I wanted to start by thanking everyone and thanking all of you for your understanding for our family's need for silence in the past couple days. It's meant a lot to us. And I continue to thank the community for their generosity and support. It's overwhelming. It's unbelievable. I am one of the luckiest people in the world. I'm a twin. Sorry. I have a bond with Nancy that no one in the world has. All I have to do to remember her is to look in the mirror. And I will continue to talk to her every morning as I always have. She's my biggest supporter. And she's my biggest fan. She's my best friend and my soulmate. She's my sister and she's my everything. She will always be half of me. And I promise to live my life in a way that makes her proud. And her spirit will always be alive in me. Nancy, I love you, and I always will. Thank you.
That's so sad. When she said that all she had to do to remember Nancy was look in the mirror, that's tough. Sometimes loved ones will say that, someone's children reminds them of them, but when you look in the mirror and you always get reminded, that would be really hard.
Chief Medical Examiner Dr. Jon Butts conducted the autopsy. Nancy's dental records had been requested to confirm the woman's identity either way. Given insect activity was present at the time that the body was found, entomologist Wes Watson examined insects found on the woman's body and concluded that she had died between sometime around 1 a.m. and 6 a.m. on Saturday, July 12th. The woman had a faint linear mark near her throat, about 1.3 inches long, and a fractured hyoid bone. Her eyes had evidence of petechial hemorrhaging. On her left leg and knee was caked clay-like dirt. Due to the level of decomposition and insect activity, it was difficult to determine whether there had been cuts or bruises on the body, though there were 3 marks on the back of the woman's neck, possibly left by manual strangulation. The victim's stomach contents consisted of a small amount of reddish fluid, a fragment of what could look like an onion, and traces of caffeine. She didn't appear to have been subjected to forced intercourse. Traces of blood were found under her fingernails, but unfortunately a viable DNA sample couldn't be obtained, partially due to the level of decomposition. The cause of death was asphyxiation by strangulation.
But what struck the investigators as odd was that her diamond earrings were not taken, so this didn't appear to be a robbery. And even though her bra was brought up, she did not have signs of actual sexual trauma or forced intercourse. So why would somebody have killed her? That was the question. But it takes me back to cases like Rachel Moran and even the Lake and Riley case recently. These women were merely running on trails near where they lived, and they were both brutally killed, whether or not sex was even a motive. So sometimes just the fact that there's this attractive woman running like prey can attract evil people to target them. Sometimes they're just beaten to death for no reason other than some internal hatred that these men have. It's sick. I mean, it's so bad that I don't even run outside ever because I just can't. It's too sad. I'm way too scared. Unless I was maybe with two people and one would probably have to be a man, because even with two women, I don't think you're safe. And that's unfortunate, especially when you're right around your own home.
The following day, on Tuesday, July 15th, Cary Police Chief Pat Bazemore announced that the body found near the storm drain was in fact Nancy's, and this case was now being investigated as a homicide, with Detective George Daniels appointed as the lead investigator. Chief Bazemore was quick to add that the public had no reason to fear for its safety, and that this death was an isolated incident. They did not have any suspects, but they were confident they could bring the killer, whoever they were, to justice.
That always strikes me as odd when they say there's no reason to fear that this will happen again.
I feel like they say that so they don't cause public chaos.
Exactly, because they have no suspects and no one has been arrested. So it seems like the police knew more than they were letting on.
Well, they did know more than they were telling the public, but they were still piecing the things together, and Nancy's family bravely attended this press conference. Brad, however, chose to last minute stay home with the kids.
Which can definitely seem like a red flag, I will say. But then again, I don't know if I could face the cameras and this public situation.
Putting the kids in that as well.
Exactly. And the police had been crawling all over the Cooper's house, and Brad was exhausted. I mean, he probably didn't get much sleep in those few days after what had occurred.
At the press conference, reporters fired questions at Chief Bazemore about a possible motive. For investigators, the autopsy results were puzzling, since, as Kimber mentioned, the murder didn't seem to be sexually motivated. If Nancy had been out running and someone wanted to rob her, why leave behind the diamond earrings? Chief Bazemore revealed something Brad had told reporters, and police had known since Jessica had called in the missing persons report, saying that Nancy and Brad had been having marital difficulties. However, the chief was quick to point out that there were no suspects, meaning Brad wasn't being considered one. And just because there were strains in a marriage doesn't mean the husband is in fact responsible for murder.
However, we do know spouses and ex-spouses are the number one persons of interest, so it did matter that their marriage had issues, even though it's not uncommon for couples to have to work through problems.
People have created stereotypes and statistical evidence for a reason.
That's true.
Either way, there was more evidence to search for and many other people to interview before the investigators could move forward. But in the back of the detective's mind was an odd statement Brad made when he'd been told that Nancy's body was found. Brad commented that when Nancy went out running, she usually wore a red and black sports bra. It was a very coincidental thing to say, given Brad hadn't been told how the body was dressed, and he said he did not see her leaving prior that morning.
But wouldn't he know what she regularly wore when she went out running? I could easily tell police that you were wearing like something black. I think most of us could say what our spouse or loved one was wearing. That wouldn't be that suspicious, but I get it. They have to go on any clues that they have.
Right. If I didn't see you for a week, I could tell the officers I know exactly what you wore. At least
A
you're
week?
black.
Why a week? It was only like a day.
I'm just saying, I could go a week and I know that you're going to wear black leggings.
Right. That is true. That's true.
Brad told Detective Daniels that on Friday, July 11th, he and Nancy had argued before the cookout, which was right before Nancy ended up going missing. That didn't look good. Plus, when the investigators started speaking with friends that actually saw the couple that night at the party, they said that Brad and Nancy were arguing in front of everyone. And at the very least, they'd exchange words in a very angry way in public. It was actually no secret that there was tension in their relationship. Even Brad admitted to a media outlet that he and Nancy had been sleeping in separate bedrooms.
Yeah, that is not a good sign. I think many of us can say that we might have been there sometimes in one of our relationships, not us. I'm saying in the past, we've all had it where it's breaking down. And I feel like if a couple doesn't even want to sleep together anymore in the same room, but to be fair, my dad and my stepmom, they did not sleep together after a while because he snored so bad. It was that bad. So even if you're not having marital troubles, maybe you can sleep in separate rooms, but it is a red flag.
Well, Brad admitted in their case it was because there were things they were working through, going to couples counseling, and he actually commented that he thought they'd be getting along better and working things out as of late, because Brad told detectives he had an affair, which was the reason there was conflict in the marriage. But he was committed to making it work with Nancy, and things had been improving. The affair apparently happened back in 2004.
Yeah, but it was with one of Nancy's best friends, Heather Mator. And it wasn't Brad who admitted it to Nancy. It was actually Heather in the spring of the previous year in 2007, when she finally came out and admitted that she brought her kids over for a play date with little Bella. Nancy wasn't home, and Heather and Brad had sex in the closet of the primary bedroom at the Cooper's house. Can you even imagine someone doing that in your house? I mean, doing it alone is bad enough. With your best friend, that's even worse, but also in your own home, that's definitely a deal breaker. You'd be thinking of it every single time you walked into your closet to get ready. Plus, when Nancy confronted Brad, he denied it. He said that never happened. And this is a pretty big thing for a close friend to lie about. I mean, why would Heather be lying? And Nancy only wanted the details so that they could work it out together. But Brad just kept gaslighting her, making her feel bad for even thinking that he'd even do that to her. But finally, just about 6 months before this murder, during New Year's Eve, Brad admitted it was true. But he said it only happened once and it didn't mean anything and it would never happen again. That's also when they started counseling. But it is easy for the cheater to say that it meant nothing, but it means everything when the person you love willingly makes this choice to give themselves to someone else, especially your best friend.
Plus, from what investigators were learning from Nancy's friends like Jessica and Hannah, things had been rocky for some time. It wasn't just the affair. From the beginning of their marriage, it seemed that Brad was actually married to his career and cared more about making money and being successful than he did about Nancy and the kids. See, Nancy grew more and more unhappy, and after Brad ended up admitting that he'd had sex with Heather more than just one time, Nancy said she wanted a divorce.
Right. That actually came out during their counseling sessions. Brad even said that he continued seeing Heather because he thought that he had feelings for her. So at that point, Nancy was like, I'm done. There was no coming back from that. It was the ultimate betrayal for her. Brad seemed to understand all of this, and they even amicably agreed to split up, sell the house, and then Nancy, who was sad and wanted to be close to people she loved, including her family, would be able to return to Canada with their daughters. This was in contrast to what Brad told detectives. He made it look like they were working things out. But remember, there were boxes of things that were half packed up in the house. And in Jessica's original call to 911, part of her concern was not knowing what to do. She knew that Brad hadn't reported Nancy missing yet or even called her family. Jessica was worried that if she said anything, there could be consequences because
Brad felt Jessica might be interfering.
Right. She didn't want Brad, if everything was okay, she didn't want to reveal anything that she knew about their situation, basically. And that's why in her call, she was like, I don't think he's ever been physically violent, but I know there's a lot of tension. That's what she told the dispatcher. And she went on to say she wouldn't be surprised and she'd hate to say it, and she never finished that sentence because she was scared to voice her worst fears and even speak something terrible into existence. But everyone close to Nancy was thinking it. They were thinking Could it be Brad?
On Wednesday, July 16th, crime scene tape went up around the Cooper home, where investigators had now shifted their focus. Having finished processing the area where Nancy's body had been found, they had to get formal warrants to search the residence and the couple's vehicles because Brad had refused to allow further searches. Patrol Officer David Hazelzett had noticed pieces of straw at the scene where Nancy's body was found. Now, back in the foyer of the Cooper home, he noticed the same type of straw on a pink oval rug. Unfortunately, as crime scene technicians didn't wear protective foot coverings in processing the scene in Fielding Drive, it was impossible to tell how the straw got there. Was it the same straw where Nancy's body was found? Had it been tracked into the house?
That's unfortunate. It's so important in these type of cases for forensics not to be undermined by things like that. Plus, this officer didn't collect the straw or tell the other investigators about it. And while bags of evidence were being removed from the property, including Brad's computers, he hunkered down with his friend, Scott Hyder. He did provide a court-ordered DNA sample and fingerprints, but Brad was leaning on his friends and caring for Bella and Katie with their much-needed support. There was nothing to publicly suggest that he'd been involved. And we know investigators need to eliminate spouses as suspects as a matter of routine. But it was still a confronting sight in a family-oriented neighborhood to think that this man could be responsible. Jessica's husband, Brett, reminded one of the news outlets that Brad was distraught. He told them, Brad is suffering, and he didn't want people to start listening to rumors. And it is true, you're innocent until proven guilty.
In the meantime, members of the public had been calling in saying that they'd seen someone matching Nancy's description running on the Saturday morning when she went missing. And this runner was seen in the vicinity of the routes that Nancy usually took. A local resident, Rosemary Zednick, claimed that around 7:10 a.m. she saw a woman matching Nancy's description running on the Lockmere Drive bicycle path, traveling toward Kildare Farm Road, listening to an iPod. Rosemary had stopped to untangle her dog's leash, so she was quite close to the woman that she claimed was Nancy as she ran past. The woman made eye contact and exchanged hellos as the jogger continued down Lockmere Drive. Rosemary claimed she recognized the woman as Nancy when she saw her in the flyers the next day.
And another local resident, Curtis Hodge, who was driving to work along Kildare Farm Road between 6:50 a.m. and 7:10 a.m., also claimed to have seen a Chevy van containing two men that he described as Hispanic pull up beside a woman that he believed was Nancy. She also matched her description. Could someone have targeted Nancy? And was this van in question involved? That's what the investigators were trying to find out. But by now, it was also public knowledge that things were strained between Nancy and Brad. And the shocking circumstances of this case weren't just making headlines in North Carolina, but across the country and all the way back in Nancy's hometown in Canada. Because no information about the cause of death had been released, the speculation was running wild.
Nancy's friends provided information that they could to the investigators, but they did stay tight-lipped regarding the media and the inner workings of the couple's marriage. Their loyalty was to Nancy and her memory, and they knew if they wanted to bring the killer to justice, no good would come from airing the Coopers' dirty laundry to reporters, especially since the investigators weren't naming Brad as being involved. The things that went on behind closed doors were private matters, and Nancy was too good of a friend to be disrespected in such a way by those she trusted and who were grieving her sudden loss. Her friend, Mike Morwick, spoke for many of Nancy's friends when he released in a group statement saying, quote, "At this point, we do not want to jeopardize the investigation in any way, nor do we want to be hurtful, nor do we want the hurtful images and stories to be propagated in a way that exacerbates an already incredibly difficult situation for those of us who were so close to Nancy." End quote. Police Chief Bazemore cautioned that nothing should be read into the police search of the Cooper home. It was a formality, and excluding a spouse from a murder investigation early on was just as important as looking for evidence that may incriminate a certain individual. As far as investigators were concerned, this was a matter of routine and nothing more until they had a reason to believe that Brad was linked to the murder. He was an important person to eliminate as a suspect first, and that's what detectives were working towards at that point.
But He had also lawyered up already, and that was his right. And it's always the smartest thing to do, even if you have nothing to hide and are completely innocent. He hired Howard Kurtz and Seth Blum, and the attorneys released a statement on his behalf, making it clear Brad wouldn't be speaking to the media, requesting privacy for their client while he grieved, and urging anyone with information to contact the police. They let the media know that Brad was devastated by the news of Nancy's death, and he was continuing to assist law enforcement to try to bring Nancy's killer or killers to justice. They went on to say that Brad was a very private man, and he wasn't accustomed to the glare of this media spotlight. He never dreamed that his face would be splashed across television, news shows, and magazines or in the headlines, especially not under these terrible circumstances, and that people grieve in different ways, and that Brad wished to mourn privately.
But the pressure was about to intensify for Brad. His father-in-law, Gary, and Nancy's twin sister, Krista, had retained Nancy's personal family law attorney, Alice Stubbs, to represent them to apply for custody of Bella and Katie. The reason for this was important to them because the family was concerned that the intense police focus on Brad made him mentally unstable and emotionally incapable of adequately parenting the girls while dealing with such a horrific situation. And this obviously wasn't good for the girls. They also thought in the back of their minds, what if he actually had killed Nancy? They wanted to be safe rather than sorry. If he was capable of murder, who knows what he may do to the kids? And I can't blame them for thinking this way.
Exactly.
Wakes County District Judge Deborah Sasser granted the application on an emergency basis. Unlike Brad, Nancy's families had been speaking openly with the media, with Gary telling one news conference, "I think this is an act of extreme cowardice by whoever did this, and I think if they had a shred of decency in their body, they would come forward and acknowledge their guilt." The custody documents not only laid bare the Wrens' concerns regarding the risk they believed Brad posed to his own daughters, but shed more light on what was going on in the Cooper home for quite some time and in the weeks and months leading up to Nancy's murder.
As late as back at Christmas time in 2002, which was only like 2 years after the couple moved to the States, Nancy returned to Edmonton for the holidays, and she told her family that the fact she couldn't work in the United States caused her to be extremely bored and unhappy, and she didn't even want to go back to North Carolina. Her younger sister, Jill, actually said to her, "Well, you decided to marry him. He's your husband. You need to try to make it work." So that is what Nancy did. Things got better when Nancy began branching out, meeting new friends, and she started working as a nanny for extra cash. But Nancy had not only found out that Brad cheated with Heather, but also with another woman. By the time the truth came out about Brad's feelings for Heather in therapy, Nancy told her lawyer she wanted out, but she was stuck. Her lawyer told her if she left, she could lose everything, possibly even custody of her daughters. And that was too much to risk. Of course, this whole time, she was confiding in her family, and they claimed that Nancy had told them Brad was verbally, emotionally, and financially abusive, berating and yelling at her in front of Bella and Katie, and he withheld Nancy's access to money, which meant that she would have to ask her family and friends to help cover basics like groceries and supplies for their daughters. Yikes. People don't realize that financial abuse is a thing because Brad controlled all of their finances, which makes it almost impossible for someone to leave.
Nancy's family's complaint to the court for temporary custody of the girls reiterated that things were so bad that Nancy was desperate to take the girls and return to Canada to move in with her sister Krista, and Brad had initially agreed to this the previous winter when the couple were discussing the divorce, but by the spring of that year in 2008, Brad changed his mind, taking the girls' passports from Nancy's SUV where she hid them. Nancy was the only one with the key, which is why she always had her keys with her even when she went on a run. Her car was the hiding place for her important documents, but somehow he got in there and got a hold of everything. Even though the couple had been living in the country since 2000, Brad was only on a temporary work visa, and neither of them had a green card. Under Canadian law, Nancy needed Brad's written permission to take the girls out of the country. If Nancy decided to go to Canada alone, there was no guarantee that she could re-enter the United States, especially if the marriage was dissolving, as her immigration status was directly tied to Brad. And I can see why Nancy felt like she was being held prisoner in the U.S.
Yeah, she felt trapped, and that would be terribly isolating, and her family had their own ideas about who was responsible for Nancy's murder. And given Brad's behavior towards their daughter, they were not prepared to leave their grandchildren in his care. And because of the paperwork that Nancy's family had filed, the court ordered Brad to turn over his daughter's passports, which was definitely a win. On the evening of Friday, July 18th, before the girls moved to Canada with Nancy's family, they held an invitation-only private memorial at Bella and Katie's preschool, the Triangle Academy. Many of the people who searched for Nancy united in their intense grief. Nancy's pastor asked her family and friends to share stories of how she touched their lives. There was over 100 people in attendance, and they recited the Lord's Prayer and they sang, "You Are My Sunshine." The next day, they had a larger public memorial where 170 people gathered to remember Nancy.
With Nancy found and the focus now on identifying her killer, her family requested that the community remember Nancy by tying white ribbons around their mailbox or a tree. Seeing the flyers around the town bearing her smile was much too painful, and these were soon taken down. Interestingly, Brad didn't attend either of the memorial services. He had only attended an impromptu prayer service at the local Lutheran church the morning after Nancy's body was found, but before her identity was publicly confirmed. Nancy's mom was surprised by Brad's minimal interaction with her, even after giving him a supportive hug. It seemed like he didn't want to have anything to do with his wife's family or friends, which made him look even more suspicious. On Wednesday, July 23rd, back in Canada, Nancy's family brought Nancy's body home to say their final farewells at Edmonton's Grace Lutheran Church. Over 350 mourners gathered to pay tribute to their loving daughter, sister, friend, and mother. The dance by Garth Brooks was played along with "You Are My Sunshine." Friends and family spoke fondly of their memories of Nancy and how their lives were all richer for having known her. Bella and Katie placed a single white rose beside their mom's urn.
Nancy's mom and dad still had emergency custody of Bella and Katie, but in preparation for their next hearing, both sides came out swinging. Law enforcement was holding their cards close to their chest regarding the criminal investigation and the background of Brad and Nancy's marriage. So the custody hearing represented one of the first opportunities for the media to be able to gather more information, and lots of ugly details of what was going on behind closed doors started to come out. The next custody hearing was on July 25th, again before Judge Sasser. The affidavits from Nancy's family and many friends painted a picture of a marriage in crisis and a woman desperate to escape an abusive situation. Nancy's attorney, Alice Stubbs, requested Brad be psychologically evaluated to prove he was fit to retain custody. According to the affidavits, Heather wasn't the only woman that Brad had been emotionally unfaithful with either. There had been multiple instances. In March 2007, while Brad was studying at NCSU, he joined several other students on a brief class trip to France to study with French students enrolled in a similar program. And Brad's classmate, Joey, noticed that Brad took his wedding ring off and spent a lot of time with a young French student, Celine Busson. Joey was shocked when Brad actually told him that he was going to leave Nancy to be with this other woman, considering the couple had 2 children together, and Katie was less than a year old at the time. Wow, that's cold.
Nancy was also fed up with Brad's constant criticism of her housekeeping and parenting skills, and him comparing her efforts to their other female friends who had paid housekeepers. In November 2007, Nancy emailed Brad outlining all the responsibilities she took care of, none of which Brad contributed to. Nancy wrote, "You think that it's easy? You're being unfair and ignorant." After rattling off a full list of everything she did daily around the house and for the girls, Nancy concluded sarcastically that, "You're right, Brad, I do nothing."
Being a stay-at-home mom is a full-time job, not even mentioning all the housework, but being at work all day can also be grueling. But it seemed like Brad liked to be away, which is evidenced by his unfaithfulness. But of course, Brad had denied the affair with Heather for months. But when he finally admitted everything, Nancy emailed her parents saying that she was concerned about Brad being depressed, given that she said he attempted to take his own life in his younger years. So even though things were rocky, Nancy still cared about Brad. She loved him, and she hoped that all of this wouldn't cause him to do something drastic. When Krista visited Nancy in February of that year, just months earlier, to provide her with physical as well as emotional support, she was shocked by how unhappy her sister was. Brad had removed Nancy's access to their credit cards, their bank accounts, and he put her on a restricted cash allowance of $300 a week. Now, I know some may say, wait a moment, he's bringing in all the money, and $300 a week isn't really a low amount. That's like $1,200 a month. Not to mention Nancy drove a luxury car. She wore luxury purses. And to some, they could argue Brad was not in the wrong by making her a budget since they were in the middle of figuring out their divorce. But others can say that's messed up because Nancy had no other way of making a living, and they should share the income since she's providing home and childcare. Everyone sees this differently, so what are your thoughts? I would really like to know.
Brad had also taken her name off of all the household utility accounts too, so when the water was shut off for a late payment, Nancy couldn't get it turned back on.
Okay, that's a little odd and annoying, and not to get too personal, but I've been in that situation where I can't even access accounts because my name isn't on them, and it's very frustrating.
Nancy was unable to afford the bare necessities on the insufficient weekly allowance, so to make extra money, Nancy began selling her clothes at garage sales and was paid in cash by her friends in return for helping painting their houses. There were days when she was with her friend Hannah and she told her that she couldn't even afford diapers, and Hannah even overheard Nancy calling Brad and telling him she only had $2 to spend.
That's exactly why she was helping Jessica paint, by the way. And by late winter, Nancy had made up her mind. She wanted a divorce and she wanted to move back to Canada with the girls. She planned to move in with Krista in the Toronto area. She even found a preschool for Bella and began lining up job interviews. And like we explained at first, the decision to separate was made amicably, and Nancy hired family law attorney Alice Stubbs to draw up a proposed separation agreement, which also addressed custody. But this is when things changed, because under the terms, Brad would have to travel to Canada to see his girls every other weekend and only get to see them for 2 weeks each summer. The reasoning had been that Brad hadn't been involved in his daughter's lives due to him being busy with work. He was only doing the bare minimum, and he didn't seem to be concerned with this at first when Nancy wanted to move away with the kids. However, when he read the agreement, he realized that he would have to pay for his daughters to travel when they came to North Carolina. And he was beginning to realize the financial burden that he would have to undertake. So he began rethinking things. But I'm sitting here thinking, wouldn't you have to pay for things for your kids on a regular basis if the children were there?
And both parents would remain joint decision makers for major issues impacting the girls. So he'd remain a part of their lives for big decisions. But when Nancy sent the agreement to Brad on April 18th, he never signed it because he now changed his mind. He said the deal was off.
And this was because as he read even further into this agreement, he realized that he would be agreeing to pay Nancy alimony and child support. Based on the initial agreement, which Nancy's attorney even described as aggressive, it was just a starting point. They were going to negotiate back and forth. But Brad would have to pay $2,100 a month in child support alone and nominate Nancy as the beneficiary of his life insurance policy as long as she was alive. Taking other expenses into account, including private education costs, Brad calculated that he would have to pay about $5,000 to $6,000 every month. However, he could keep his stock options from Cisco, but Nancy wanted to receive the entire proceeds of the sale of the house after the mortgage had been discharged. And I could see how some of this may come off as a burden, but Brad was unfaithful. He was the one that started all of this. It was his career. That's why they moved across the country. And then he abandoned his wife by emotionally and physically cheating. And that is why a prenuptial agreement is important.
Brad's solution was to apply for full custody of the girls, even though, as we said, he was doing the minimum in their lives before this. And now he was suddenly showing a level of interest and care that he didn't show before.
Of course he was. When he saw them as dollar signs, possibly being taken out of his account every single month, he wanted the girls with him because it would be less financial burden. He just didn't want to have to pay Nancy anything. And according to her friends and family, Brad was angry at how much he'd have to pay in child support and alimony. And at one point, he even made a crazy suggestion that each of them take one child, and that way they would only have to foot the bill for one kid. That's, I can't even imagine someone even suggesting that. So at that point, Brad rescinded his permission for Nancy to take the girls with her to Canada. And this is when he took his daughter's passports from Nancy's car and hid them, preventing her from leaving. And as you can imagine, things continued to deteriorate. By the spring of 2008, the couple were sleeping in separate bedrooms. And according to Nancy's friends, Brad was self-absorbed, controlling, and neglectful. He worked long hours in order to avoid being home and contributing to the share of the domestic and parenting responsibilities. None of them ever saw or knew him being physically abusive, but he was emotionally, psychologically, and financially toxic. Brad only cared about work, training for his Ironman competitions, and being away from his family. The husbands of Nancy's friends didn't like him either. They found him to be cold, except for maybe Mike Hiller. And if you didn't know better, Brad's blog presented a picture of a man who didn't even have a family.
Nancy's loved ones thought it was odd that none of the posts on adventuresofbrad.com included any mention of his wife, daughters, whom he claimed to be so devoted to.
I wasn't able to find it, but you did. I don't know why I couldn't find it because I looked and I didn't find his blog at first, but you went and found it.
Yeah, I found some blog posts, sure.
We couldn't really see much though. Like I went through when he talked about which bikes he was using and like what trails he was going on and how he was getting better and his timing and stuff like that. But the fact that it is called Adventures of Brad gives you a clue. But then again, if it is about biking, maybe he thought, why would I be talking about my wife and children?
I don't think there's anything wrong with him having a isolated blog posting about his own feats and success.
I didn't see anything too weird or red flag about it. But Nancy told her friends about how Brad was listening in on her phone calls on the house phone. So when she realized he was doing that, she would use only her BlackBerry cell phone to make calls so that she could have some privacy. And he also had computer expertise. Remember that. So somehow he got into her emails because he would know things that she only shared with people over the computer. And that's odd. I mean, then again, if you're saying things your partner shouldn't hear, that's not good either. But the two of them were not in a good place.
Remember Nancy's friend and neighbor across the street, Diana Duncan? Well, she had been in the process of organizing a farewell party for Nancy in April before her move back to Canada. Her friends had even pitched in to help cover costs of her move back, but when Brad began objecting to the terms of the divorce, they weren't sure whether to have the party. But the event still went ahead, and sadly it was tinged with uncertainty and sadness for Nancy. She didn't know when she'd be leaving or if she'd even get the chance. Then by the summer of 2008, according to Nancy's friend, Dr. Teresa Heckling, Nancy was actually scared of Brad. She regularly slept with the girls in separate bedrooms behind a locked door, and she always slept with her car keys in her pocket. She didn't go anywhere without them because she didn't want Brad having access to her vehicle, where she kept the passports for her and the girls, her divorce paperwork, and the things she was documenting about the marriage.
Through the years, Nancy had spoken to her family about leaving Brad and returning to Canada, but the realization of what she needed to do truly hit home when it came time for her family to return to Canada after that recent summer vacation in early July, right before she went missing and was found murdered. Nancy told her father she was done and she needed to get out. She knew that staying was no good for her or her daughters. She didn't want to say goodbye to her family. She was sobbing when her mom was at the airport departure gate. She just kept saying she wanted to come home. And then when she returned from this trip, which was supposed to be a getaway from all of her worries, she was greeted with a home that was disgusting. Brad apparently hadn't lifted a finger to clean while she was away. She called her parents and she left a voice message, and we're going to play part of that for you now.
Hi, Mr. Call. I was just getting out of the house. I'm in bed. I'm just heading over to Jessica's house to tape and do the trim, take the trim and stuff so I can start painting tomorrow. And I've been furious all night last night and today. I came home and the house was so dirty. I mean, there was an ant infestation on the table. Because the plates that the girls and I ate on were still there, covered in food and ants. And they went into the cracks of that table. I couldn't get it Out today, I had to call an exterminator. There was these wormy things. I don't even know what they were. I thought that at first they were gross worm, but they weren't white. They were black. Anyway, I can't even get into it at this point. I'm so furious at how disgusting my house was when I got there. Anyway, hope all is well. I hope your guys safely got home. Obviously, there could be causes, but hope all is well. I'll talk to you later.
It really is frustrating to come home to a mess, one that you didn't make, and an adult that didn't take the responsibility to clean up. It's as though he thought, she would just do it for him. And there was an infestation of ants from old food that Brad had left out. And remember, this was only a week before her murder. And according to Diana Duncan, she saw Nancy and Brad arguing on the evening of the party at her place. It was about Nancy telling Brad that Jessica had paid her $240 to help her paint her house. He told Nancy he would cancel her allowance that week since she was already getting paid. It was one of those days that Diana said that Nancy described as an I hate Brad day. She was seething with anger about her husband being controlling and selfish. And even though Brad had only been at the cookout for an hour, he and Nancy had a heated confrontation off in one of the corners of the home. He was supposed to be on childcare duty to supervise the girls while Nancy socialized. And this was an agreement they already made. And it seemed that he was struggling whenever he had to take care of Katie when she got fussy. He just didn't seem to want to deal with it. While Nancy wasn't hiding how angry she was, she said at least 3 times that night to Diana, I hate you, Brad Cooper. I hate you, I hate you, I hate you. There was even a woman at the party, Donna Lopez, who wasn't even friends with Nancy. She just met her that night. Yet Nancy didn't hold back about her marital issues. I mean, she was drinking as well, so things were coming out. But so much so that when Donna went home that night, she told her husband she was worried about Nancy. She seemed like such a nice person, and she was scared of what might happen to her. That's really odd. She thought that something bad was going to happen because the situation at home was really bad.
And the next day, when word spread that Nancy was missing, both Diana and her husband Craig felt that there was something off about Brad's behavior. His reactions seemed rehearsed. They seemed forced and fake. When Diana went inside the house to help Brad look for Nancy's dress, she noticed things looked different. Brad and Nancy usually parked their vehicles in the driveway, given that their garage was usually cluttered with household items and toys. Diana noted that there were no toys in the garage, and it looked as though someone had cleared enough space for a car to be parked inside.
Right, meaning that Brad may have done something to Nancy and then moved all this stuff so that a car could be put into the garage to put her body inside. They were really trying to piece things together.
Remember, all this information is now coming out in court documents regarding the fight over custody before Nancy was found dead. And Brad had a very different account of the dynamics within the marriage, supported by affidavits from friends of his own. He claimed Nancy was a shopaholic who had expensive tastes and regularly overspent on things like designer clothes, jewelry, and art for the home, putting them in credit card debt to almost $45,000. He had documents to show that most of the debt was from her credit cards and not from his. And for this reason, Brad claimed he had to give her that restricted allowance, which she still didn't budget for. He explains that status was an important thing to Nancy and he let her do it too much. According to Brad, Nancy called him the budget Nazi, and he wouldn't be surprised if she called him that to her friends behind his back.
Well, Brad's friend, Scott Hyder, who coincidentally had formerly been married to Heather, remember the woman that Brad cheated with? Well, he supported Brad. He claimed that Brad was a man doing his best with a wife who thrived on manufactured drama and engaged in extravagant spending beyond the family's means. Scott stated that Nancy often exaggerated about the details of their stories for dramatic effect. She liked to tell people things just to get attention. And Brad claimed his absence from the home, they were for work reasons, not because he wanted to avoid being a present husband and father. His affidavit outlined how he felt like he was a great father, that he was fully involved in his daughters' lives. And his father, Terry, denied that Brad ever suffered from depression or had a desire to take his own life. They were implying that Nancy just made that up to make Brad look unstable.
But Brad did admit to being unfaithful in his affidavit, but also claimed that Nancy had strayed too, with a married man named John Pearson, who actually dated Heather as well.
Heather had been with 3 of the men in their friend circle. She was married to Scott, she dated Jon, and she hooked up with Brad.
Well, this situation between Jon and Nancy apparently happened after a Halloween party in 2005. So after Brad had cheated with Heather, but before Nancy found out about the infidelity, and Jon confirmed it was true. Jon had walked Nancy home, and Brad was out of town at this time. And this was never mentioned to the police when they initially interviewed Jon after Nancy had gone missing. However, later he did admit to saying that there was no romantic feelings, but they had this one indiscretion. His memory was hazy, but he recalled he and Nancy going inside her house, and they took showers, then went downstairs and they had sex, but they stopped midway through and put their clothes back on and told each other they will never speak about this ever again. But all this came out in therapy, and Brad was made aware of it. Jon told investigators that he didn't want to come out with this information because he didn't want to hurt his family or paint Nancy in a bad light.
Despite all of this, Brad claimed he wanted the marriage to work and still loved Nancy. He pointed out that he chose not to post pictures of his family on his blog because he got the advice of Nancy's brother Jeff, who we told you was a police officer, and he warned Brad that child predators could use those images for sinister purposes. Now, going to the custody issue between Nancy's family and Brad, despite that being a civil matter, Brad did provide information in his affidavit specific to Nancy's disappearance. He detailed the morning that he said he last saw Nancy. He claimed that at 6:15 a.m. on July 12th, he went to the local Harris Teeter supermarket that was only 4 minutes from their home to get milk for Katie. When he was on his way home at the intersection of Kildare Farm and Treon Roads, Nancy called him from their house at 6:40 a.m., asking him to pick up juice and detergent. Okay, but you know that I love maps. The first thing I noticed when I mapped this was that those crossroads are out of the way. If you are watching, you can see this on the screen. I put an X on those roads, but there's a much faster way to get back to their house. So I was wondering, why was he taking the long way? That struck me as odd. And if you keep going on that road, Kildare Farms, it turns into Lockmere Drive, which you can take to Fielding Drive. And that's the road where Nancy's body was found. It's just something I noticed. You know, red flag a little bit right there.
But we already know that Nancy's body was found near where they lived.
Yes, that's true. And there are many roads you can take to get there. I just thought I would point that out. It was a personal observation I made.
Well, Brad explained in the affidavit that after he received that call from Nancy, he went back to the store to get the other items and then returned home. When he arrived home, that's when Nancy went out for her run. And at first, when she didn't return, it wasn't unusual since Nancy was often gone for long periods of time. Brad claimed at this point in the investigation, his attorneys had been pushing for police and medical examiners to release more information about Nancy's death, to allow Brad to refute rumors that he was somehow responsible. Investigators also requested surveillance video from the Harris Teeter from the morning of July 12th to confirm he had gone there. And sure enough, they pulled the footage, and in the first clip, you can see Brad buying a gallon of milk. He then left the store and then came back later to get the additional items and left a second time. So he did go to the store that morning.
Let's go back to the temporary custody hearing between Brad and Nancy's family. Judge Sasser granted temporary custody of Bella and Katie to Nancy's family until October 13th, which Brad agreed to. The girls would live back in Canada, but return to North Carolina for 2 supervised weekends, 4 hours each day with Brad at the Wake County Visitation Center. He was also allowed at least 4 phone calls and video calls a week with the girls for 15 minutes. Following the proceedings, Brad's attorneys held a news conference reiterating their client was innocent of any involvement in Nancy's death, and that they realized that the information that's come out can make it appear as though Brad hadn't been the best husband. He lied, he cheated, but being unfaithful and a terrible spouse in general didn't make him a murderer, and that there was no evidence at this stage directly implicating him.
In the weeks following Nancy's murder, it proved difficult for the media and therefore the public to get much more of an idea about how things were progressing with the criminal investigation, or even information about exactly what evidence had been seized from the Coopers' home, their vehicles, and Brad's office, and the reasons why. Superior Court Judge Donald Stevens had sealed the search warrant, stating that releasing the documents could potentially jeopardize the investigation and prevent any defendant from receiving a fair trial later. On July 31st, Judge Stevens ordered that warrants remain sealed for another month. While the details of the search warrants remained a secret, investigators continued pulling together information to help them understand what had happened and why. When the search for Nancy had been underway, those who knew of the inner turmoil in her marriage held on to the slim hope that perhaps she just left for a few days. She had been so overwhelmed with the implosion of her dream suburban family life that she felt that there was no alternative but to leave and regroup for a few days before returning home and hopefully ready to move forward.
Possibility, yes, but probable, no. Not from what Nancy's family and friends knew of the woman they loved. For her to leave and not tell anyone about her plans was so unlike her that they were immediately alarmed. For them, it could only mean that something sinister happened. And we know that evidence seemed to point circumstantially towards Brad. Law enforcement knew that Jessica didn't mention the painting plans to Brad when she called him to find out where Nancy was, even though Brad already knew. She didn't want to cause any issues because she knew he wouldn't approve. And recall that when Gary learned from Krista later that day that Nancy was missing, he turned to his wife and said, "This story's not going to have a happy ending." Well, they had their suspicions early on. And when her body was found, multiple people in their life suspected Brad killed her, but there was nothing to prove it. In early August, Nancy's friend, Carrie Clark, remember the woman who Brad claimed that she went running with? Well, she swore in an affidavit that she never went running with Nancy that morning, and they didn't have plans to meet up that day. And their plans were actually for the next day.
There still had been no formal suspects identified, and the tire marks near Nancy's body definitively didn't have a match to either of the couple's BMWs, but Police Chief Bazemore reassured the public that the investigation was progressing well, saying, quote, "I want to express my absolute confidence that we will solve this terrible crime and bring the person or persons responsible to justice. Cary remains one of the safest communities in the nation," end quote. Several weeks later, on what would have been Nancy's 35th birthday, Chief Bazemore publicly expressed law enforcement's continuing focus on identifying the killer and bringing them to justice. But sadly, there were no arrests or charges to announce, so Nancy's friends and family continued the agonizing wait for positive news.
By this time, Detective Jim Young had been in touch with AT&T, Nancy's cell phone provider, and he wanted to seek advice on accessing and downloading the data from her BlackBerry. Well, Detective Young already had Nancy's phone records, but he wanted to see what else could be recovered from the actual device. An AT&T representative provided instructions to Detective Young about how to unlock the BlackBerry because cellular forensics wasn't this officer's area of expertise. These included instructions for using a special code to bypass entering an incorrect password. So several days later, Detective Young tried accessing the BlackBerry based purely on his memory of this conversation with the AT&T representative. After entering an incorrect password several times, a message popped up on Nancy's BlackBerry stating that if Detective Young proceeded, the data would be erased. What do you think he did? Well, he tried turning off the device and he accidentally wiped the entire contents. He didn't try to contact AT&T because he didn't even remember the name of the representative. And wow, like I've said before, this kind of stuff makes me so angry. Why was the device given to an officer that didn't know how to do this and wasn't an expert in phones? I don't know.
Finally, on September 2nd, the search warrant records were unsealed, and for the first time, new information was revealed. State Bureau of Investigation agents had seized 33 pieces of evidence from the Cooper home, cars, and Brad's office. These included 3 computers, a hard drive, 2 cameras, a pillow, Nancy's green dress she had worn the night of the party, a black sports bra, a red shirt, the pink oval rug that had the straw on it, a men's white pullover Nike shirt, a fitted bedsheet from Nancy's bedroom with dried red spots, a pair of light blue and gray Saucony running shoes, a pair of pink A6 running shoes, black high-heeled shoes with mud caked on the heel, men's sneakers covered in mud, 2 address books, car seat covers from Brad's vehicle, bed linen, documents, and something that appeared to be a pink fingernail. From Brad's Cisco office, 5 computer disks, computer, hard drives, handwritten calculations of alimony payments based on the couple's debts and assets were also seized.
And when it came to the couple's BMWs, City County Bureau of Identification agent Michael Galloway noticed the trunk of Brad's sedan appeared to have been vacuumed recently. Yet the passenger side of the car contained discarded old receipts and mail. And investigators had to wonder why Brad had cleaned just the trunk of the car and not the other part at the same time. And Brad explained he'd spilled gas in his trunk, which was why he only cleaned that part of the vehicle. But they didn't smell any gas in the trunk of his car. So that was very odd. And on the inside of the lid of Brad's vehicle's trunk were several fibers. There was grass on the front passenger seat, hair from the bottom front bumper, hair from the left front wheel well, and brownish green vegetable matter on it. On an external handle of the driver's side door was a reddish brown material. So all of this was of interest.
Agent Thomas Como and Agent Ivy McMillan tested multiple pieces of evidence seized from the home. These included soil found underneath the shoe rack in the laundry room. Como also tested the stained bed sheet as well as streaks found on the garage floor and inside the home, on the counters and on the floors. Nothing was suggesting the staining or streaks were left by blood. Soil samples were taken from Fielding Drive where Nancy was found, as well as the Cooper home, to compare the muddy, high-heeled shoe. The item thought to be a fingernail turned out not to be. Agent Como also tested the white Nike's men's pullover. It had 3 small rust-colored stains on the front left side of the collar, and the fabric fibers in the chest area had been torn. No DNA was recovered from the cigarette butt found near Nancy's body, nor the rug, pillowcase, or trunk floor of Brad's BMW.
Even a geologist named Heather Hanna examined soil samples found on a pair of open-toed shoes that Brad wore on July 12th and compared these with the soil at the Cooper's home and on Fielding Drive. She did find a mineral called white mica, and it was similar to what was found where Nancy's body had been dumped. However, the geologist didn't conduct tests comparing the two samples because she noted that white mica was commonly found in soil across the country, so it couldn't really link Brad to the crime. The search warrant showed that early on, investigators were so suspicious of Brad's demeanor and his behavior just prior to and after Nancy's disappearance that they wanted to forensically search his laptop to see if he'd searched online for information about how to kill someone and how to dispose of their body. They were also looking for evidence of the couple's troubled marriage. But then the police learned that in the months before Nancy's murder, Brad had signed out equipment from Cisco to use at home, including a router, which activity logs showed he'd used as recently as 10 p.m. on the night of July 11th. However, no such router was seized from the home. The interesting thing was that Cisco only had 2 routers like this at their office, and Brad never returned the one he borrowed. So where was it, and why did he need it?
The documents also revealed that when officers spoke to Brad and searched the home after Nancy was reported missing, he had thoroughly cleaned the bathroom near the bedroom where Nancy and the girls had been sleeping.
And we know this man isn't naturally tidy and willing to lift a finger, so it seemed odd.
Very odd. He also told them that after canceling his tennis game, he'd passed the time waiting for Nancy by scrubbing the floors, doing the laundry, vacuuming, and even washing a large rug.
He's offering this information even though he didn't take time to clean the entire week that Nancy was away on vacation. Only when she's missing, he decides to be Mr. Mom.
And we know, and so did the police from interviews that he did with people who knew Brad, that he didn't usually clean at home, but from his perspective was being helpful. He explained that given their ongoing discord, especially after their tiff at the party, he was trying to make Nancy happy. He even helpfully washed the exact dress his wife had worn to the cookout, telling police the day after Nancy disappeared that she'd complained she'd spilled wine on it.
And wasn't that the same dress that he claimed was black? And he knew it was green, and he washed it. Why did he say he didn't remember and he had to go check with her friend to confirm the color? Remember, he was supposed to hand this over to that dog so that they could get her scent to help in the search. So that was odd.
And when detectives spoke to Nancy's family and friends, they said that Brad never cleaned the house or did laundry. And they played a voicemail of Nancy being furious, even saying there were worms inside the home, maybe maggots. The bathrooms were disgusting and there was no food in the house. Scraps from the last meals that Nancy and the girls had eaten before they went on vacation were still on plates in the kitchen.
But now all of a sudden he cleans. As you can imagine, the media, online message boards, discussion forums, and the comment section of news sites were going crazy over these new details. To many, the circumstantial evidence pointed in the direction of only one person being the killer, Brad. But Brad's lawyers dismissed the hype, saying none of these things were proof that he was involved. And they claimed that if anything did point to Brad's guilt, he would be in custody. From Canada, Nancy's family released a statement expressing their trust in law enforcement, with Gary saying that their family continued to have great confidence in the Cary Police Department and applauded their efforts. Brad's lawyers were intent on setting the record straight, though. From their perspective, it was really convenient that all of Nancy's friends were willing to sign affidavits making claims about Brad being an abusive husband. But where was the proof? The legal team subpoenaed Nancy's friends to provide documents and information to prove what they were saying about Brad's character and the marriage. This was the same time when Brad's attorneys released that security footage from Harris Teeter at 6:22 a.m. and 6:41 a.m. the morning of Nancy's disappearance, as well as photographs of 2 receipts from the store. Rumors were now swirling that the detergent Brad had purchased contained bleach. And his attorneys wanted to shut down any speculation about this because they felt like the facts were being distorted. But what didn't help Brad's case was that a woman who didn't even know the Coopers, who wasn't on Nancy's side or Brad's side, came forward saying that she witnessed Brad screaming and cursing at Nancy in the parking lot of the girls' preschool as recently as May 2008.
We know that this is a lot of information, but in late September, Judge Sasser ordered Brad to undergo a psychological evaluation that was requested by Nancy's family. He would be seen by a professional selected by Nancy's family's attorneys. The FBI intra-agency computer analysis response team was still forensically analyzing the Cooper's computers, hard drives, and email accounts at the same time. Special agents Gregory Johnson and Detective Chris Chappelle found that following Brad's trip to France in March of 2007, as part of his MBA, he continued emailing that young woman, Celine, the student he'd been spending time with in France. They signed off their emails to each other with the French word for kisses. Brad suggested Celine come to US for her internship. He also told her he was thinking about moving to France and that he found 2 jobs in Paris that he could walk right into.
Wow, there are more and more red flags going up left and right.
Plus, the agents also found that from April 6, 2008, somebody had installed a program on Nancy's computer that forwarded all of her incoming mail to a Gmail account linked to Brad's blog. It would leave all those original emails unopened.
That was how he knew what she was emailing. I like how they said someone installed a program. We know it's Brad. He's the IT guy, and it's clearly being forwarded to him. This allowed him to read Nancy's private emails between her and her lawyer, as well as messages between her and her friends, and even an ex-partner who she was hoping to catch up with when she moved back to Canada. And we know that all of this would have fueled more anger towards her. Among the things the agents found was that the day before Nancy disappeared, Brad accessed and read her emails 3 times. And just a couple days after her murder, Monday, July 14th, someone using Brad's computer visited the Air Canada Airlines booking page. I wonder who. If she's dead, who else could it be except for Brad? Part of what makes this case so complex in terms of the amount of information and at the slow rate at which it was trickling out to the public was that the custody of the children between Brad and Nancy's family and the criminal investigation was going on at the exact same time. And at that point, if no criminal charges were made against Brad by the next custody hearing, the judge would have to take that into consideration when making their next decision about custody. So in preparation for the 3rd custody hearing, which was set for early October, Brad had to sit for a 7-hour deposition, and I watched this. There was a lot of information he had to reveal, and that he did reveal about the state of the marriage. We're going to highlight some of the parts we found most important. For one, he admitted that he had denied being unfaithful to Nancy. He said that he thought if he told her about it, it would ruin their family and their kids would be affected. And he thought if he denied it, it would just go away and they could remain a whole family.
Brad also admitted to taking one of his daughter's passports from Nancy's SUV and keeping it at his office so she couldn't flee to Canada with their girls. He was concerned about her behavior and spending, saying she spent more than we had, which was unfortunate, and she drank a little more than I would have wanted her to.
Brad also spoke in his deposition about the night before Nancy disappeared, then the following day. And this might sound like a broken record, but there were some new claims. He said when she didn't return from her run that morning, he assumed that she stayed out longer to punish him. He knew that she was mad about their argument over the decision not to pay her allowance that week because Jessica was paying for the painting. So he claimed he thought she was just trying to make him angry and get back at him. So to make himself more useful, he did 5 loads of laundry and cleaned the house from top to bottom to try to make her happy. He even had the support of his friend Mike, who in his own affidavit claimed that investigators had put pressure on him to say that he helped Brad with an alibi. Mike claimed that across several of these interviews, the detectives accused him of making those calls from the house or Nancy's phone to help Brad establish an alibi. But Mike said he never made any calls and he denied helping Brad cover anything up. And if that's true, if investigators are really trying to coerce someone or force them to admit something they didn't do, that only really makes them look bad. Like they are really trying to just pin things on Brad.
And unlike Nancy's other friends, Mike and Laura didn't feel the Coopers' marriage was as bad as they were making it out to be. Police wouldn't comment on Mike's claims, but Detective Daniels was now being open about the fact that Brad was not cooperating with investigators. Even after almost 3 months, he continually refused to come down to the police department to answer questions. And you know how they say your past can come back to haunt you. Yeah. Well, another affidavit, this time for someone back in Canada, didn't paint Brad in a favorable light when it came to romantic relationships.
Oh man, people are starting to come out of the woodwork, and rightfully so. This is a murder investigation. So if they had any information, it was important for them to come forward. Remember that before Brad began dating Nancy, he was engaged. Well, he was engaged to a woman named Jennifer Ball. Jennifer told Nancy's family's attorney that during their relationship, Brad was emotionally abusive and made her fear for her safety. He constantly belittled her to other people, and she had never before or after ever been in a relationship with someone who treated her so poorly. Jennifer found out that Brad had been going into her apartment without her consent when she wasn't there, and she was so scared that she moved out. So if you're wondering why their engagement was broken off, these were the things that were brewing behind the scenes.
And recall how Brad's attorney were pushing to gain access to the full police file on the criminal investigation. Well, they had claimed that it was purely to access information that could demonstrate Brad was a fit parent for his custody hearing, but law enforcement pushed back because they felt it was nothing more than a fishing expedition for Brad's attorney to help him build a potential criminal defense, which wasn't even needed at this stage because no charges had been brought against him.
But going back to the October hearing after the deposition, well, the details that Brad gave were inconsistent with his initial statements to investigators. So it was no surprise that the judge denied Brad's request to regain custody of the girls. Something that I found kind of funny and interesting was at the hearing in mid-October, Brad's attorneys asked Nancy's family if they felt that Brad should regain custody after Nancy's murder had been solved. And well, her twin sister Krista replied, no, because he'll be in jail. So you know where they stood on who did this.
However, Brad's attorney reminded the court that there was no proof he was involved in Nancy's death or that he was an unfit father.
The criminal investigation continued. We know that by now, Brad's attorneys released that CCTV footage from the Harris Teeter that Brad visited the morning Nancy disappeared. The first time he was seen walking into the store was at 6:22 a.m., and he was wearing tennis shoes, jeans, and a long-sleeve shirt. But when he returned at 6:42 a.m., he was wearing open-toed shoes, and that's weird. Did he keep an extra pair of shoes in his car? But why would he need to change them mid-trip? Plus, these tennis shoes that Brad wore in the first CCTV footage weren't seized because when officers went to find them, they couldn't be found and Brad couldn't produce them.
But the most incriminating evidence was found on Brad's laptop. Remember how he claimed he fell asleep with Bella and Katie around 9 p.m., and then he waited for Nancy to get home and heard her come in at around 12:30. Well, his laptop told a very different story. Activity logs on the computer showed it was being operated up until around midnight, so right before Nancy arrived home from the cookout. It also had been operated more than half a dozen times on the morning of Nancy's disappearance. It turned out that Brad's laptop held an especially explosive piece of evidence that didn't help his case. FBI technicians could see that on July 11th, someone using Brad's laptop while it was at the Cisco office had conducted a Google Maps search, which was timestamped at 1:15 p.m. So a little over 12 hours before Nancy would leave Diana's barbecue. The town of Cary's zip code had been typed into the application search bar. Someone was doing a search of the area around where the Coopers lived.
I know you've been saying someone, and that's how the investigation went. They were only going off what was on this device. They don't have a camera showing who was using it, but of course, it's Brad's laptop. It's not like Nancy was searching while she was over at Brad's office. And then, after searching around this area, the user, Brad, zoomed in, wait for it, to the exact location where Nancy's body was found 3 days later. I mean, come on. Brad was clearly searching for the perfect place to get rid of her. That's insane. But the investigators kept an open mind. They were just documenting what they found, and they reported that whoever was searching that exact location on Brad's laptop looked around the area for 41 seconds before quitting the application. No other areas were searched, only where the body was found on Fielding Drive. This was the smoking gun. This is what they needed to arrest Brad.
So, less than a week after the custody decision on October 27th, a grand jury handed down an indictment for the person who police announced for the first time was a suspect, 35-year-old Brad Cooper. He was arrested at home and charged with first-degree murder. He was denied bail and held in county jail awaiting trial. Chief Bazemore held another press conference where she now explained that, quote, "This was not a random act of violence, but rather a domestic issue of the very worst kind, and she encouraged every person in a challenging relationship to take the steps necessary to keep themselves safe. She said, don't wait and don't think it can't happen to you," end quote.
Sadly, it can really happen to anyone, and that's why we talk about these cases, to hopefully inform and possibly help someone by spreading awareness. But this was just the first step, this arrest. They still hadn't proved that Brad killed Nancy.
There was still a long way to go, but Nancy's family were relieved that charges had finally been brought against the person that they believed was responsible. Her father, Gary, praised detectives for working tirelessly and thoroughly. If Brad was convicted of killing Nancy, he would be sentenced to either death or automatic life without the possibility of parole.
On October 29th, with Brad now in custody, another search was conducted at the Cooper residence. Detective Young was looking for the left sneakers of two right-footed pairs that were originally stored on a shelf in the garage side by side. During the search, officers from Cary Police Department took an additional 4 pairs of shoes. They also seized several pieces of women's jewelry from a dresser in the bedroom where Brad's mom, Carol, had been staying after Nancy's murder. She was there to support her son. These items included a diamond ring, a pearl necklace, a pin, 2 more rings, and Nancy's diamond necklace. It was in a drawer where Carol's sweaters were. It was interesting to find the diamond necklace because Nancy's family and friends said it was rare for her to ever take it off. While they were on vacation just a week before her murder, Nancy wore that necklace the entire time. And according to her mom, she even wore it in the water. It was a very special piece. It was one that Brad allowed her to get. And when I heard allowed, it just made me cringe. So, had he taken it off her neck so that he could get his money's worth?
Among other items taken from the home and vehicles were Samsung and Motorola cell phones, thumb drives, wireless devices, a modem, 9 mini discs, 12 CDs, 7 DVDs, an MP3 recorder, 2 notebooks, and 3 receipts, and officers continued gathering evidence in what was still a very active investigation. One of the receipts was from a local Lowe's hardware store where a tarp had been purchased for $4 at 9:30 a.m. on the morning of July 11th, paid in cash. When investigators reviewed the CCTV footage, they saw Brad was the one making the purchase. The tarp had ended up in the garage unopened. What was interesting about this was it wasn't the purchase, but the lies that Brad told around it. He told police he was late to work that Friday morning because he was helping Nancy at the home with the girls, and that he'd brought the tarp for Nancy to use at Jessica's house.
Stop. That is so obvious. Why keep the receipt if you go out of your way to pay in cash? Lies. Jessica had told the police that Nancy didn't use a tarp as a drop cloth when they were painting, and Brad didn't even know about the painting job until later at the party. Meanwhile, there are a couple other things I'd like to mention. November, the court ordered Brad not to sell any of his assets, including the family home, until a child support schedule had been finalized. And with Brad now facing trial, new restrictions were implemented regarding the access he had to his daughters. There were no more visits, only phone calls. Then in early December, the Wake County First Assistant DA Howard Cummings announced that the prosecution would not be pursuing the death penalty. Under the state law, no aggravating factors had been identified at this stage, and the investigation was still continuing. This would potentially change depending on any further evidence that was uncovered. 5 months later, in mid-May of 2009, Nancy's parents reached an agreement over permanent custody for 4-year-old Bella and 2-year-old Katie. They would remain in custody with Krista. Under these terms, if Brad was found not guilty of Nancy's murder, he could then request for reconsideration. On the first anniversary of Nancy's death, the Cary community and Nancy's friends honored her in ways that were truly fitting. They established Nancy's Butterfly Fund in conjunction with a nonprofit called Interact to help survivors of domestic situations leave abusive relationships by removing those financial obstacles. They wanted to prevent what happened to Nancy from happening to other women.
Over 100 people, including Nancy's twin sister Krista, participated in an 18-mile fun run starting at Coca Booth Amphitheater, going around Symphony Lake to raise money for the fund. To celebrate the end of the inaugural event, participants wrote messages on white balloons for Nancy and released these into the sky. $35,000 had already been raised thanks to multiple generous donations from the community.
Time was ticking by, and it seemed like forever since Nancy had been killed. 5 months later, on February 4th, 2011, 37-year-old Brad pleaded not guilty to murdering his wife. The defense did their best to delay the trial, telling the court they hadn't received all the evidence that they were entitled to, and they needed to give Brad the best defense possible. Among the information they were requesting related to whether Nancy was alive on the morning of July 12th and details pertaining to that fling in 2005 with John Pearson. They were trying to peg him as an alternative suspect, saying that the two of them had phone contact in June, a couple weeks before her murder, and maybe he had a motive to make her disappear because maybe she was going to reveal their fling. It seems like a stretch. They also wanted to change a venue because they said Brad couldn't get a fair trial in Cary because of how much media coverage had been on the case, but the court denied the request.
Brad's trial finally got underway on February 28th, 2011 at Wake County Superior Court in Raleigh, before Superior Court Judge Paul Gesner. In addition to Nancy's family and Brad's parents, media from Edmonton was also present in the courtroom. The prosecution case was that Brad was the only person with both the motive and the opportunity to kill Nancy. Prosecutors played Brad's full videotape deposition, where he provided background on his relationship with Nancy, the breakdown of their marriage, and his movements on the morning his wife disappeared. Their theory of what happened was that at 1:15 p.m., the day before Nancy disappeared, Brad used Google Maps to search for a location to dump Nancy's body, with the intention of killing her. He found and then zoomed in on the exact spot where Nancy's body was later found. They also said that the couple argued at the party about Brad's decision to withhold Nancy's allowance because Jessica was paying for her painting work. At that point, Nancy was livid and had a confrontation with Brad during the cookout, and then later that night when she came home from the Duncans around midnight.
This reminds me so much of the Chris Watts case, just this part. And of course, they both have a child named Bella. But the prosecution also told the jury that she and Brad, who was enraged, argued further that early morning to the point where Brad carried out his plan. And he may not have known it was going to happen at that moment, but it was clearly what he intended to happen at some point by searching for the dumping location, getting the tarp, and they said that he strangled her, then placed her body in one of the couple's vehicles, probably his, since the trunk had been cleaned. And so sometime between Nancy arriving home and midday the next day, Brad dumped her body out on Fielding Drive, which most likely occurred early that morning at 6 or so, when he was also pretending to get items to calm Katie down. Then at some stage, he cleaned the house, washed the dress that Nancy had been wearing, since she was most likely wearing it when he strangled her, and he wanted to make sure there was no proof of what happened.
So you may be wondering about the call that came in from the Cooper's landline to Brad's cell phone when he supposedly was out at Harris Teeter that first time. Well, remember the special router that had been checked out from Cisco? The prosecution told the jury they would show proof that Brad set up that router, and with his IT expertise, he programmed an automated call from his computer to his cell phone at 6:40 a.m. to make it appear it had come from Nancy using the house phone, giving the impression she was still alive.
Wow. And that does make so much sense. It's like he thought of everything, and he thought he was smart enough to outsmart the authorities. And the prosecution claimed there was no evidence that anyone else had killed Nancy or wished to harm her. Not even John Pearson, the man she had a one-night fling with back in 2005. John had other plans the night Nancy was last seen. He was hanging out with none other than Heather. You know, the woman that Brad cheated on in the closet, and the ex-wife of Brad's friend Scott. Well,
during the trial, a Cisco expert, Paul Geralt, testified that it would have been easy for someone with Brad's level of skill and expertise to program a remote automated call to be made to his number from his computer and a router to make it look like it came from his home phone, making it appear that Nancy was alive at the time of the call. Brad had previously stated in his deposition that while routing calls wasn't something he typically did, it was something he knew how to do.
But Brad's attorneys, who were being paid by the state, by the way, told the court that the only reason their client was on trial was because police had no other suspects and no other theories about who could have killed Nancy, and that they targeted Brad from the beginning and overlooked other evidence. They said that investigators allowed themselves to be heavily influenced by gossip and speculation perpetrated by Nancy's friends, who they described as a clique, and they refused to entertain the possibility that someone else other than Brad was the killer. The defense argued that a sloppy police investigation focused solely on Brad, purely in order to solve the case. They said that investigators had failed to follow up with witnesses, like the local resident Rosemary Zednick, who claimed that she saw Nancy that morning. But it turned out the detectives did interview Rosemary and all the other witnesses who reported seeing a woman out running, even though it wasn't until 3 months after Nancy's murder. But the investigators were confident that these witnesses had not seen Nancy. For one thing, she never ran with an iPod like Rosemary claimed. So it was just this tip wasn't given priority. You know, they still looked into it. Brad was someone very close to Nancy with a lot of red flags.
But there was one piece of evidence in Brad's favor that was from Nancy's autopsy. There was no food in her stomach at the estimated time of death, but there was caffeine in her bloodstream. The defense argued that if Brad had killed his wife soon after she arrived home from that party, she would have had food in her stomach. And it was unusual for Nancy to have coffee before she went on her morning run.
I tried thinking about this one, and it usually takes about 2 hours for food to digest. And maybe she was only drinking past a certain point. Like she wasn't eating anymore. And maybe to stay up later that night and party, she drank some coffee. And by the time she was killed, limited food was present, but the caffeine was still in her bloodstream. I don't know.
The defense also claimed that there was no evidence that Brad had acquired the necessary computer port and router required to fake the 6:40 a.m. phone call from the house, or if he had even done this at all. They disputed the reliability of the timestamps on the Google Maps images retrieved from Brad's laptop, claiming that 72% of the timestamps on the 3,627 files found on the device from July 9th through the July 12th were considered invalid anyways.
I listened to that part of the trial. They were saying that someone planted this on Brad's computer, and they had been hoping to present 2 witnesses to testify that the evidence regarding Google Maps and all the searches had been planted by the investigators in order to frame Brad. But the judge denied letting this evidence in. He determined that one of the experts wasn't qualified, and the other one wasn't on the original witness list, so they were not allowed to testify. So this decision led Brad's attorneys to call the judge biased, but really, in truth, no one at the police station had the expertise, it was determined, to hack into Brad's computer, go into Google Maps, and change timestamps. I mean, it was a stretch. Brad's attorneys also said that, remember the detective who erased the BlackBerry? Well, they claimed it was done on purpose. But the prosecution had witnesses to testify. They already had all of her phone records. They knew who she called, when she called them, who she texted for months before the murder. And all of her friends had the text messages on their phone still, so it corroborated the evidence.
Finally, after 7.5 weeks of evidence from almost 100 witnesses, the jury retired to deliberate. They had 3 options given to them by Judge Gesner. They could find Brad guilty of either first or second degree murder or acquit him altogether.
In file number 2008 CRS 22922, the state of North Carolina versus Bradley Graham Cooper. The verdict of the jury reads, "We, the jury, by unanimous verdict, find the defendant, Bradley Graham Cooper, to be guilty of first-degree murder."
After 2 days of deliberation on May 5th, Brad was found guilty and automatically sentenced to life in prison. Nancy's family was feeling so many emotions. This was finally the outcome they'd been hoping for, but hadn't always been sure they'd get. Justice had been served for their beloved daughter and sister. But they were not celebrating. They actually had deep empathy for Brad's family and knew they'd be distraught over the verdict.
It's hard to put yourself in someone else's shoes, but those parents were losing their son and their grandbabies. But of course, Brad immediately appealed. And in September of 2013, the North Carolina Court of Appeals overturned his conviction, granting him a new trial. Yeah. The court found that the judge had erred in denying the testimony of the defense experts regarding that planted evidence on Brad's laptop and the questioning of the timestamps. The state attorney general requested that the North Carolina Supreme Court review the case, but in January of 2014, it was denied. The retrial would be going forward. Nancy's family and friends were heartbroken, and I can only imagine it's like you did all that work for nothing. They were trying to get on with their lives as best as they could following the trial. Especially Gary, Donna, and Krista. They were focusing on Bella and Katie's well-being, and now they were suddenly faced with the turmoil of another lengthy legal proceeding once again. And as the months passed, they prepared themselves for heading to court again. But that September, there was some unexpected news. 40-year-old Brad took a plea deal. He actually pleaded guilty to second-degree murder. In court, he admitted to killing Nancy, but he didn't give any details or an explanation about why, or even an apology. Wow. I guess his lawyers were like, listen, it's in your best interest to just plead out because you're now facing life. And in the end, the judge sentenced him to just 12 to 15 years in prison. So it turned out it was a better deal. It kind of reminds me of the recent Michelle Tricona's trial. If you know, you know all about her sentencing. Yeah. Just like in Brad's case, he had already served 5 years. So they gave him time served, which would mean he was due to be released in late 2020, only serving 6 years.
But one good thing was that Brad's reduced sentence would relinquish his full parental rights, allowing Krista to adopt her nieces. Upon the end of Brad's sentence, he would also be deported back to Canada and could not re-enter the United States.
Let me tell you that the judge definitely had something to say about Brad's willingness to trade the access to his own daughters for freedom at a sooner rate, right? Saying that it bothered him that this individual was able to bargain away his rights as a parent. And I find it repulsive. Basically, trade your children for less time in custody.
But there is some bad news. On November 16th, 2020, Brad was released from prison, having served his sentence. From all accounts, he was deported and is prohibited from having contact with his daughters. Even though 50-year-old Brad is now said to be back living in Canada, the case remains controversial for those who maintain that he is innocent and that the police investigation was flawed.
I stumbled upon an entire YouTube channel dedicated to wrongful convictions, and Brad's case was highlighted with all the flaws in the trial and the investigation. And I do like to be informed on everything people are saying about it. But for me, I can't get past the router being checked out by him being the expert in internet calls, and the fact that he could have easily set it up so that the house phone automatically called his cell. And then the router was never found. Plus the Google search of the site where her body was found it's too much of a coincidence.
In the end, Nancy's memory continues to live on in Cary, North Carolina, amongst the friends she made who will never forget her or the joy she brought into their lives. One place they go to remember her is the Memorial Black Granite Bench in Regency Park. This was dedicated in Nancy's honor about 3 months after her murder, and is engraved with her portrait and the lyric, "You Are My Sunshine." It's a place of quiet reflection in the northeastern bank of Symphony Lake where her friends can sit with their memories of Nancy in one of her favorite places where she used to go to take her girls.
Nancy's daughters, Bella and Katie, who would now be 20 and 18 at the time of the recording, grew up in the warm and safe environment of their aunt, uncles, cousins, and grandparents, having their mother ripped away from them by their own father. A man who claimed to love Nancy has no doubt left a painful emotional hole that can never be filled. When the girls were old enough to understand, they were told that their mother was killed by a bad man who went to prison and that their mom was in heaven. But I thought about that when I heard it and I was like, didn't they ask where their dad was?
Right.
Because it wasn't made clear that he was the bad man. But of course, as I got older, I'm sure they were able to be aware of everything that happened. And they lost both of their parents. But what I thought was one positive thing was that their Aunt Krista looked exactly like their mommy. So at least there was that memory that they could have just by looking at her. That concludes today's case. Give us your thoughts in the comments. And thank you so much for watching this video and being here for Nancy's story.
We will see you in the next one.
Bye.